Okay, everyone to tipping point. Our topic for today is language for evaluation, whereby we are going to look at how texts convey evaluative and attitudinal meaning. And from Sydney, Australia, we have all the way Professor Dr. Peter White from the University of New South Wales, Australia, who will enlighten us, give us light, okay, to light up our dark tunnel in our mind while learning more about appraisal framework. And currently, it is very interesting when I found out that, okay, apart from he's the principal architects of the appraisal framework and account of the means by which texts convey evaluative and attitudinal meaning, together with Dr. James Martin. And he's also, okay, he used to work as a journalist and journalism trainer for almost 20 years. Sydney Morning Herald, the Adelaide Advertiser, Special Broadcasting Service, SBS, and it is it's a shock when I found out that he is also a semi-professional jazz musician currently performing on saxophone with the Traveling Circumstances Jazz Combo. And with that, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Peter White to begin. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes, thank you for that very kind introduction. Yes, and it's wonderful to be here. I guess these are the changes we've sort of gone through, haven't we? Because of the pandemic, that we're now kind of more the world is available to everyone. So it's great to get to have a chance to talk with all you people about appraisal, the language of evaluation. Now, I think we only have an hour, don't we? So
we can have more. We can have more if you have more time.
Okay. Yes. Well, I'm certainly. It's evening here, so I'm not. I have no other obligations. So yeah, we can spend some more time, certainly. What I'll do. I mean, I think you might have got an email pointing you to a web page. I'll just send that round in case people haven't got it there. I've sent it on the chat.
Yes, I already sent it.
And I've just added some things today, so you can actually download the lecture slides that I'll be going through today. They're at the top of the page, and there's a little bit of an activity we may get to. The rest of the pages is other notes. I certainly before COVID, I'd sort of be traveling often, giving workshops, but typically, for a couple of days, 2 or 3 days, and so those materials are from longer, obviously, sort of 2 and 3 day workshops. But then you may find it useful if to look through some of those notes, and you can also see the sorts of activities, the text that I use, because when I'm doing a workshop, obviously we get into doing analysis rather than me just talking, but we may get time to do a little bit of analysis today as well. We'll see how we go. Okay, so I guess I'm going to need to do some screen sharing. I'll just pull up my PowerPoints. As I said, there is a copy of these there in PDFs, so if you wanted to follow along there, it's available. Okay, so just how are we going with the screen sharing? Okay, so you're getting the PowerPoints there. Have they come through okay?
Yes.
Yeah, they're there. Okay, all right. So I'll just see how we go with getting those to play. It's okay. All right, so everyone can see that okay?
Yes.
Yep. Okay. So so obviously introducing very much an introduction to, now you might see the term appraisal theory. We perhaps use that a bit less. We certainly used that more in the past. There's some discussion, debate around whether it's a theory or not, but I still find some value in that, although there are arguments around whether we should call it a theory or a framework, but that's my choice here. Yeah, so broadly speaking, our topic is to do with ways of being evaluative in language, although some more recent work over the last decade, people have explored, being evaluative in other codes, in other forms of communication, in visual communication, for example. So, but specifically, we developed it for language, and I should say, the work, in the Martin and White, the language of evaluation. I guess it's important to say we were talking about English. Now, we have found other people have explored evaluative meanings. What are the options for evaluative meaning making in other languages, and have found the model, the framework we developed to be useful, but we don't assume that the same kind of systems of options necessarily apply or operate in all their delicacy in other languages. I think if people are wanting to work in other languages, it's important to, in a sense, explore what are the systems of options in another language, or certainly if you're interested in translation, which some of my students work in, they need to look into their own languages and say, well, do we have, for example, the same system for what we call judgment, which is assessments of human behavior, character. Okay, so now there were some questions I think that I was asked to address. How do I use appraisal analysis as an analytical tool in qualitative and quantitative research? Well, I hope to sort of today we'll get some sense of that. Certainly both it can be qualitative and quantitative. I guess it tends to be more qualitative due to the nature of evaluative meanings, due to their kind of subtlety and the nuance, and the fact that they very much depend on the context, on the text in which they're operating. But many people have used it for quantitative, where they've tracked the number of instances, for example. So yes, both. Can we apply across multidisciplinary dimensions? Well, I guess certainly it's used in many different contexts for many different forms of communication, in science, in language learning, in history, in an analysis of literature, in journalism studies, in political rhetoric studies, so very widely distributed. I mean, if you look on the web page I put up down the bottom there, there's a link to there's a bibliography where there are hundreds of references to people who've published using appraisal in some way, or at least referring to it. And that would be, if you're interested in the range of studies, I would recommend, when you have a spare moment, to scan through that, and just you'll see from the topics, the titles of the journal articles, you'll get a sense of the very diverse range of its application. Do we need an iterator to check our analysis for trustworthiness? Very interesting question. Certainly, some people do use iterator reliability checks. However, I would say it's not as simple as, if you're doing an analysis and you're looking for patterns in the occurrence of nouns or verbs, or hedges or boosters. It's more complicated than that, because so often the conclusions one reaches to the evaluative workings, to what is actually evaluative, may depend on the reading position of the analyst, which isn't to say that, having multiple people do analyses and compare their analyses, that I'm not saying that's not worthwhile, but sometimes what you end up doing is agreeing on discovering the reasons why people would analyze the evaluative text in different ways. So one of the things appraisal can do is give you an explanation of why people might read a text in different ways. I've done my own kind of analyses, and I've had classes of students analyze texts, and I've had them divide equally as to whether they thought the text was sort of broadly positive or negative with respect to a particular person or issue or development. So yeah, but certainly an interesting question, the whole issue of iterator reliability. And I think the discussion today should reveal why that is the case. Okay, so I just thought to get people thinking, and you know, I'm hoping people will jump in and offer you know, comments or questions. I'm not planning to sort of just talk for an hour or longer. Let's just do a little bit of appraisal analysis. Appraisal, of course, is our frameworks, taxonomies for identifying and characterizing expressions, wordings that by which we evaluate. And evaluation, of course, is quite wide-ranging. There are different lines of analysis. Certainly, an obvious line of evaluation is whether a text or speaker is conveying a positive or a negative perspective, or is positioning or inviting the reader or the listener to adopt a negative or positive view of some person or some event. Let's just have a look here from it was a commentary piece, a subjective piece of journalism from the Times of a few years back. And it was this weekend, it took the El Paso native and Democrat candidate Beto O'Rourke to draw an unabashed and explicit link between the rhetoric of Donald Trump and the white nationalism that leads to shootings like this one. And he was, of course, right. Now, the shooting was a tragedy that had occurred back in 2019, a mass shooting mainly of Latinos, people of Spanish background in Texas. There were 20 or 30 people gunned down by a person, sort of a right wing, a white supremacist. Okay, so this is so I just invite people to consider this. So I guess would people like, so who's being evaluated here? Who's being positive evaluated and who's being negatively, or what is being positive and what's being negatively evaluated, to what sort of end, to what rhetorical end? Is anyone ready to jump in and
please do, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah.
Who's the primary focus of an of positive or negative assessment here? Don't be shy. What do people, they might need to jump up, just unmute and offer us anyone? No? Okay, well, look, do jump in. You know, please feel free to go off mute. Okay, so I guess obviously, well, the focus here is, of course, the rhetoric of Donald Trump, isn't it? That's what's how is the rhetoric of Donald Trump being assessed? By what if we were going to do if we wanted, you know, if you can imagine an analysis and we want to say, okay, let's look at how this text positions the reader to view Donald Trump and things he says. What are the actual language options here, which function to position the reader to view Donald Trump's speeches, rhetoric in a negative light? Anyone want to offer any suggestions?
Yes, somebody put on the comment.
All right. Okay. Okay. Well, I'll just check if I can track those comments. I'll yeah. So all right. I'll try and track those as well. Yeah. Yes. Yes. So Emily. So white nationalism is white nationalism a positive or negative term? If I call something negative, how, and on what basis do we say white nationalism is a positive or negative term? What do people think? So, well, yes, certainly, I guess part of it is, of course, isn't it? Because of the discussion that's already gone there in the community, in the media, in politics, in which white nationalism is seen as racist. And so, of course, partly we're relying on our experience in the language. We're relying on a whole lot of other texts that we carry with. Yes, connections, isn't it? It's intertextual. If we just admit white nationalism, for the first time, we would not necessarily jump to the conclusion that it's a negative. But of course, we're assisted here, aren't we? Because it's white nationalism that leads to shootings. So presumably, even in this text, something that leads to shootings, people being killed, is obviously by in terms of our every common sense, if you like, our moral order, we're positioned to see that white nationalism leads to shootings. We've got a past history of knowledge of white nationalism and its references, its intertextuality. So that's negative. And so, of course, if the rhetoric, if there's a link between his rhetoric and white nationalism, then we're actually clear the text is positioning the reader to regard Donald Trump rhetoric in a negative light, as associated with something that leads to murder, to killings. But you can see it's so, there's more to it than that, isn't there? Because it's the Withrican, it took the El Paso native and Democrat candidate Beto O'Rourke. You may have heard of him if you followed at all the election before, they selected Biden as the Democrat, but Beto was one of the people running for the Democrat nomination. But it took native to draw an unabashed and explicit link between the rhetoric of Donald Trump. Now, unabashed, is that positive or negative? If you're it's a fairly sophisticated word, isn't it? Unabashed, meaning not concerned for politeness, being very direct, unabashed. But is it necessarily always good or bad to be unabashed? I guess, does it always carry a connotation of being courageous, like speaking the truth, being prepared to say what you think regardless of whether people disagree with you? So thanks, Emily. So in this light, it's a positive, yes, courageous. But what is actually being evaluated? The link. The link is unabashed.
Excuse me, Professor White.
Yes.
Sorry for interrupting your session. No. May I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Okay. My name is Noor from Center for Language Studies, UTHM. So, in order for us to use this approach, this kind of appraisal theory research, it would be a great help if we have the backstory of the issues highlighted.
Yes. No, you mean the issues of appraisal or of this particular extract?
Yes, for both.
All right. Yes. Look, I don't want to spend too long on this. This is just, I guess, what I wanted to do with this is to give people a sense of, in a way, just how complicated and sophisticated evaluative positioning can be. In a sense, I'm answering the question, how can we do quantitative analysis? Do we need inter-rater, reliability checks? What I'm showing here is how kind of multi-layered, the workings can be. I'm just pointing here that in order to characterize Donald Trump's rhetoric in a negative light, we have it's linked with white nationalism that has resulted in murder. This was the mass killing in Texas in 2019 when some lunatic got out a rifle and gunned down people in cold blood. And he was identified as being a white supremacist, a right-wing person, arguably sort of insane if you do that sort of thing. But it's done through that a link was drawn. So a person of some standing, Beto O'Rourke was a prominent politician, and he didn't just link the rhetoric with white nationalism. He drew an unabashed link. So his link was presented as courageous. And we've also got this expression here. It took the El Paso native to draw an unabashed link. Does anyone there have a sense? I guess some, if we say, oh, it took him to do this. Is there a positive sense if we describe it? It didn't say this weekend El Paso that Beto O'Rourke drew an unabashed and explicit link. They might have said he drew, but it took him to draw. Now, this is again what my point here is, to show you just how subtle the language of evaluation can be. Because when we say in English, it took him to do this, we're implying a positive by that actual phrase. It doesn't look like there's a positive or negative word there, it took. But when we explore the way a phrase is used, often we'll find that it's associated with positivity or negativity. So yeah, sorry, we could probably spend an hour exploring just what's going on here. My point is, yes, is not for us to delve absolutely into every aspect, but just to get a sense. I hope this gives you a sense of kind of the subtlety of this language and the challenge it can be if we were going to fully explicate how we are positioned to evaluate. We're positioned to evaluate both Donald Trump, the politician Beto O'Rourke, who is of course said to be right. So this person who drew the unabashed link, a positive link, is also explicitly evaluated as being right, so positively evaluated. And note the use of this. He was, of course, right. Why? They could have said, and he was right. What's the effect of the of course here? What is a of course component? Anybody want to have a stab? Yes, Emily, it's affirmation, yes, but does it do more than that? What does it imply? What if we use of course, we're implying that yes, thank you, yes, Nazrik. When we say of course, what we're doing is implying that you already agree with me. That I'm saying something that I don't really need to say because we all know this. Yes, there's an assumption of a shared view on the part of the addressee. So, sorry if this I've sort of thrown you in the deep end. So, if it's all a bit murky at the moment, don't worry, we're going to unpack this a bit now, and I'll take you through just how we would go through to explain exactly what are the evaluations here, and what are the potential communicative consequences of the choices. When we do this analysis, it's always one way we do it is to consider what would have been alternatives. So for example, I just said, what would have, if I just said this weekend, Beto O'Rourke drew a link between, but it wasn't that. It took Beto O'Rourke to draw the link. So we ask, so why was that chosen rather than just to say he drew the link? Why unabashed? Why of course? We could have left. So what we typically do is look to what would have been the alternatives, and this gives us a sense of what's involved in these options. So let's just move on. If I can get this to here we go. Yeah, I mean, I've just put I won't go through this now, but it's on the PowerPoint on the slide. What we often do in an appraisal analysis is we are interested in an expression. I was interested in this expression. It took Beto O'Rourke to draw the link. So I thought, oh, that's interesting. Is there a connotation? Is there an evaluative meaning associated with this phrase, which in itself doesn't look like it's attitudinal, doesn't look like it's positive or negative. So we often will use a corpus, or we can use Google. And I found examples where obviously when you say it took someone to do this, the implication was that they were positively viewed. it's suggesting that they had to be courageous, or they had to be skilled, or they had to be smart, and that we would use that expression. So just an example of how we sometimes take an expression and we explore it, you know, in a corpus. And of course, a lot of this often calls on like native speaker intuitions. And if you're not a native speaker and you feel you don't have those intuitions, then of course a corpus or Google can assist you at getting at those underlying, those more covert evaluative effects. But anyway, that was just an example. Okay, here's another little bit of analysis we're going to do. Now, these are two stories, fight stories, which were written by two boys. I think they were in primary school in Australia. This goes back a few years back. I've used this many times. And they were asked, it was in just an English lesson, you know, writing, a literacy level. I think they were probably around 9 or 10 years old. And they said, okay, the teacher said, write a story for us, you know, when you were in a difficult situation, or you got caught up in a fight, or, you know, you were worried about your safety. Write it as a story. So I just invite you, if you can see it there, to, I'm just going to see if I can get that to, yeah, that's better. I'm having trouble. All right, so let's just read it quickly. And there's, again, this is another entirely different setting. This is an example of how we might use appraisal in the context of student writing, literacy development for younger children. And I want you to, we'll read them, and I want you to tell me which you think is the better story, which is the more compelling story, considering that it's you know, we can't, it's a 9 or 10 year old writing this in primary school. Okay, so fight story one. One day I was walking through the school and a kid came up to me and he said, "Do you want to fight?" And I said, "Yes." Then I took my coat off. Then he chucked the first punch. I chucked a punch back at him and I got him right in the mouth and I broke his jaw. Then I walked back and ran and he pulled me to the ground. Then I got up. Then I grabbed him and chucked him against a steel pole. He turned and ran off. I didn't bother to chase him. So that was won by one of the boys, and now obviously a different boy had his story also about a fight that he got into. There's some very colloquial slang expressions here which you may not be familiar with. Some Australian slang here. I'll read it anyway. There's one of them is twit, which is it's a rude way of saying someone's stupid. Spazzo, well, that's just a term of abuse. Pig face is obvious. Okay, so let's read it. So we've just read story one. Now, as I read through, which do you think, would you say is the better story in terms of being compelling and being an effective storytelling? It all happened when I was walking home from school. Two twits from my class decided to pick on me. They started yelling stupid names like Spazzo, Pigface, etc. I didn't mind this. I also didn't mind Kelly punching me in the shoulder. What I did mind was that Kelly kept me occupied while Matthew rode my bike around the cul-de-sac of the street. This was harmless. But still riding, he picked up my bag and jumped off the bike, leaving it to fall. This made me sore. I gave in to my temper. When Matthew saw this, he took off. So it was me and David to Kelly to battle it out. I chased him around and around the street. When I finally caught up to him, I threw punches galore. Most of them missed. Kelly managed to escape and run home. I think I was the victor, but if I was, I don't think it was worth it. So, yes, so we've already got, why don't people put in the chat, which one do you think was the better story? Just one or two. Let's see some.
The second one.
Yeah, yes. Why is it a better story? More oomph. Yes. If we were going to now say we were wanting to guide our students so choice of descriptive words, that's good. More actions and effective words. More explanation, excellent. Yes. More descriptive, exactly. Impressive, yes, great. No, all. Now, of course, if we were going, say we wanted to develop the second one, vivid. yes, vivid description, great. Some great suggestions there. If we were going to want to analyze this, or we wanted to be able to guide our students or think about how we might point them to in the direction more emotional, yes, second, I can visualize. Again, I don't want to go into detail here, but if we look at here what we see here is that yes, the second story, amongst other things, it's much more attitudinal, isn't it? The interesting thing about story 1 is it's almost free of any attitude, any positivity or negativity. A kid came up and he said, "Did you want to fight?" And I said, "Yes." I mean, it's very flat. There's no, as one of you said, there's no emotion, but there's no attitude. Now, I'm not going to do this today, but we can. What the second one has a lot of, it has assessments of human behavior. So people's behavior is judged. The two twits decided to pick on me. Now we know that picking means picking on someone, you know, being aggressive towards them, attacking them, negatively assessed. So this from the very beginning, bringing in moral assessments of what is acceptable and unacceptable. So the author is creating characters by presenting his assailants as morally wrong. They picked on him. They used, we know it's bad to call people names. So they're positioned, the reader is positioned to regard these assailants again in a negative light. But then interestingly, our narrator, I didn't mind this. I also didn't mind Kelly punching me on the shoulder. What does this indicate to us about the narrator? How are we positioned to view the narrator in terms of his moral character or his resolve? Or he's presenting himself, isn't he, as quite resilient. He's constrained, isn't he? He's restrained. He doesn't, we might have expected him to fly off in a range and get into a fight, but he shows himself to be suitably constrained. So he's positioning the reader to not only to view the assailants in a negative light, but not only that, but to be viewed in a positive light as someone who resists giving in to anger or violence. Of course, he does end up, and then of course, this is contrasted with, I gave in to my temper. Is it good or bad to give in to your temper? I think in most cultures, we shouldn't give in to our temper, isn't it? Anger is a bad thing. Temper, you know, losing control, getting angry. So interestingly, this young narrator at age of 9 or 10 is quite subtly presenting himself as this hero who initially is to be positively viewed, who's someone who's constrained, but then has a failing, who does give into his temper. So we're positioned to judge his moral standing. So again, we could spend, you know, I've given, you know, hour-long lectures on these two texts. There's a lot that's interesting. If you know narrative study, if you know, there's also issues around the genre here and how the narrative stages of this are also a part of this. This is a classic, what's called a narrative in terms of having a complication, an evaluation, a resolution, and so forth. But I just wanted to illustrate to you how now, you know, when you people were responding, you were saying insightful things, weren't you? You were saying, oh, it's a more emotive, it's more vivid. But I guess what we can offer with appraisal is something a little bit more systematic, a bit more theoretically principled, so we can add to those sorts of insights in a way that enables us to make comparisons between texts in a more systematic way. Okay, so so for those of you who've been waiting to get a bit more of a sense of what appraisal is about, I'll get to that now. Okay, so they were just some illustrations to really show you that all manner of text types, situations are susceptible to an appraisal analysis. Okay, so for those of you for whom appraisal is new, some of you I believe do have a knowledge, some of you quite a lot of knowledge, others perhaps none at all. So in appraisal, we explore the linguistic options for being evaluative. Evaluative is, I guess, when ultimately we're saying it depends on the speaker's opinion or reaction or assessment. There's no sense that we're referring, it's not about an objective reality. It's not, these are those aspects of propositions which are ultimately not provable. They come down to a viewpoint. So it provides an account of the linguistic options for identifying and classifying the particular positive or negative values put into play by a text and the linguistic mechanisms by which they are conveyed. So it's both, we talk about different types of positive and negative assessment, and the language makes a range of different ways of conveying these or implying these or positioning the reader to adopt a positive or negative view. And if we can track those and identify, it means we can offer a systematic account of how, like, for example, why story text 2 is always seen as a more effective text than text 1, or the complex workings of that short extract about Trump's rhetoric. Okay, so second point here, for characterizing and considering the rhetorical consequences of the different ways in which speakers position themselves. These are what are presented as prior utterances on the current topics and indicate anticipations of responses to the current utterance. So yes, it's both about positive and negative assessments, but at the same time, we don't just simply assert in the present a positive or negative assessment. In so doing, we often reference what other people have had to say on this topic, other people's positive and negative assessments. And also at the same time, we anticipate how people will respond. We, as we'll see in a minute, there's lots of options by which we can indicate, we assume that the person we're addressing will agree with us, or we indicate, well, maybe they won't agree with us. We present it as controversial. So this is kind of the framing of every assertion, positive or negative statement, is around how we position, the speaker positions themselves with respect to what other people have said in the past and how the people we're addressing might respond. And we can also, the third point here, these are options for up and down scaling, what we call graduating, or we have a term, graduation, the force of an utterance. That's the main point here. So, we can say he was an entirely unabashed statement, or it was somewhat, it was minimally. We can moderate the force of our utterances. So that's broadly the lines of analysis that appraisal offers you systems for identifying the different options that are available to do those sorts of things. Okay, so why are we interested in appraisal? Well, as I say, have a look at the publications which are linked there, the bibliography. You'll see the kind of questions that people address. But these are just some of the kind of research questions, issues that people often address using appraisal analysis. Appraisal analysis, as I said, it outlines what are the options for conveying evaluative assessments, and what's at stake when you choose one rather than another. It's all very much about, comparison. Why this rather than that? Why express it this way rather than that? So these are some of the common kind of reasons. First, a speaker writer's identity, or persona is very much tied up with the nature of the attitudes they express and the ways in which they express them. So if we're interested in describing, how someone's personality or identity is expressed through their communication, then appraisal provides us with tools. By convention, the second point here, by convention, different social situations, different social roles and relations, different types of text are associated with different patterns of use of the expressions by which attitudes are conveyed and negotiated. So if we're interested in comparing, different, the journalism of different cultures or commentary with news reports, or we're interested in what are the typical evaluations we get in particular scientific domain. We're interested in how advertising typically works to promote products, then an appraisal analysis will be relevant. If we're interested in judgments that people make of a speaker or a writer's plausibility, their reliability, their fairness, their authority, then that may turn on their use of evaluative meanings. We may be able to point to someone being likely to be seen as more plausible than another by looking at their use of evaluative meanings. If we're interested in persuasiveness, what makes for a compelling argument? So the basis on which a text may be persuasive can be unpacked through an analysis of the ways in which it conveys evaluative meanings. And I guess a key point here is when speakers, the second to last dot point, when speakers express a positive or negative viewpoint, they are not simply being self-expressive. They invite the addressee to share this viewpoint, or at least to regard it as plausible. It's an interesting point. We often think of the self-expression side of language of communication. We put aside, we don't consider the way that when someone expresses an opinion, how it can be confronting. I mean, I don't know about taxi drivers where you people live, but in Australia, taxi drivers are often very free with their opinions. and you get into a taxi and there's something happened politically, and a taxi driver will say, "Oh, bloody hell," excuse the swearing, but this is the genuine. They'll say that the name of the Prime Minister, what an idiot, and of course, if you happen to support the Prime Minister, that's very confronting. It's that taxi driver is demanded, in a sense, assumed that you agree, that you share that viewpoint. You may have had that feel, when you meet somebody you don't know so well, and you've just been talking about a movie or something, and that person expresses a strong opinion which you don't agree with. It can be very challenging. Do you say, what? Ridiculous, it's the worst movie I've ever, like you don't. Normally you might with your friends, if you're close to them, then it doesn't put so much at stake. So it's a key point here that positive and negative viewpoints are not, that they're invitations, almost demands that someone share a viewpoint. And it's the last point, it's via the expression of attitudinal assessments that speakers align or disalign with particular communities of shared value. And this is very much also a part of identity. Who we are is the people we align with, the people we agree with. I mean, of course, it can vary from situation to situation, but often, around politics, that can be a crucial part of your identity. But it could also be around what sort of music you enjoy, what music you think is of good value, what's of no value. So this is part of identity, but it's also part of the alliances you form in life, which is a crucial part of living in society. So these are the kind of issues that, amongst many, that we might be interested in. So look, I'm happy. So as I go through, don't hesitate to ask any questions, any points up to this stage. Anyone want to raise either in the chat or turning on your mic? Anyone? Are people who are not, who for whom appraisal is new, is it starting to make some sense? It's hopefully a little bit less murky after I threw you, as we say, into the deep end with jumping into some quite difficult language. Okay, so under the appraisal theory or the appraisal framework, you'll hear it, as I said, referenced in both ways. What we have done is say there are 3 subtypes of evaluation. If you look in the literature on stance or evaluation, you'll see different scholars kind of break things down in slightly different ways. Some people divide, you know, they'll say there's epistemic stance, you know, to commitment to the truth of a proposition versus attitude. Some people include affect, emotion as another subsystem. In appraisal, this is the way we have divided up into different systems. So what we term attitude is this is the resources, the meanings, the options by which speakers indicate positive and negative viewpoints with respect to people, objects, happenings, and propositions, or indirectly position other people to subscribe to such viewpoints. The key point here is that, yes, you know, we often will use terms like courageous or unabashed or corrupt, but equally we've already seen, haven't we, how it can be much more indirect. It is not somebody declaring someone to be courageous or resilient. It's implying that they are courageous or resilient or restrained. So it's all part of the analysis. So that's one system, attitude. We then, intensifying or downtoning the force of what they are the system of graduation. These are the options by which the force of an utterance can be, you know, he's very courageous, or, you know, he's not very courageous. Or we can actually blur or sharpen the boundary. So he's kind of dishonest, you know, in which we're not absolutely declaring him or her to be dishonest. We're sort of fudging the boundaries. So this is what we call graduation. And then we have what position, these are the engagement. These are the options by which the speaker can position themselves dialogically. These are the propositions. What do I mean by dialogically? By positioning ourselves, the speaker positions themselves, as I said previously, with respect to what has been said or is presented as having been said previously, or about how people might respond. So 3 lines of analysis. Now, often people will pick one of those, and it may be that all you need to do in analysis is track what are the attitudes and how are the attitudes conveyed, or another line would be just to look at graduation, another would be to look at what we call engagement, the dialogistic position. But I guess a comprehensive analysis would try to track all those things, although that can be very time consuming and very detailed. So I should say at this point, of course, appraisal is only one line of analysis if you're interested in how a text works, in how it, you know, how it represents people and things. There are other lines of analysis. It's not a universal analysis. It's just for focusing on the evaluative aspects of a text. There are the kind of representational aspects, what is presented as happening in the world or likely to happen. Those are who's presented as doing what to who's presented as of being agentive, who's presented as being passive. These are other aspects of analysis which are not encompassed within appraisal. So it's important. Sometimes people come to appraisal and imagine that, you know, it can encompass all aspects of the workings of a text. No, it's for a focus on the evaluative workings of a text. Okay, so 3 broad systems, but of course we can go into a lot more depth. We can be more detailed or more delicate in our analysis. And I guess crucially, we divide attitude into types, subtypes of being positive or negative. Now, what's often called emotion, or affect, we use the term affect. Examples, mobile phones in class really annoy me. So here the crucial thing here is, of course, the speaker is presenting the attitude, the positive or negative, as being a very personal response. It's basing their evaluation in their own emotions. Or, I do like being able to take calls in class. I love the new Samsung S3. So, okay, now if we went back to the fight text, we might go and say, oh, okay, well, how often was the narrator in that second text? How much was he relying on reporting emotions or not? Interestingly, there were no emotions in fight text 1, and one of you I saw in the chat had noted that. But that's not all there is. Sometimes when I sometimes obviously I teach both linguistics and journalism, and sometimes when I'm doing this for a journalism class where they're not so into the linguistic complexities, I simplify by talking about emotion versus opinion, so as to not get too detailed. And the distinction here, of course, is that in emotion or affect, it's based in a very subject, obviously personal response. Opinion, we're actually attributing qualities, positive or negative, to what's being assessed. So mobile phones in class can be harmful for students' concentration. Harmful, negative assessment of the effect of mobile phones. A different sort of assessment than just saying they annoy me or I don't like them. Or I do like, mobile phones in class can be beneficial. You can imagine you might be looking at this. This is based on some work I do with primary school teachers who are looking at developing their students' persuasive ability to write arguments. And of course, what they do find is that early on, the students tend to, when they're making an argument, it'll be by reference to emotion. This is from when teachers ask their students, to be argue in favor of, for or against mobile phones being allowed in class. I don't know what the situation is in your I understand you're from different localities, but in Australia, usually, well, more recent in the last few years, they've sort of been banned, but there was a debate about it. But if you can see, an argument might be couched in terms of affect. That I don't like them, they annoy me, they irritate me, I hate the sound of them ringing in the middle of the lesson. Or they could be couched in terms of where it's no longer it's still a personal or subjective assessment, but it's presented as being qualities of the situation or the device. So mobile phones in class can be harmful for student concentration. Mobile phones in class can be beneficial. The new Samsung 3 is elegant and easy to use, as opposed to, I love the new Samsung. So you can see, so that's, it can be useful for students to be alerted to the different possibilities and to be aware of how they make for a different type of argument. If it's all done in terms of affect, we know that typically it's not going to be as potentially as convincing as if here what I'm calling opinion. It's impolite of you to be using your mobile phone in class. Here, of course, there's been a judgment of people who use the phone rather than of the phones themselves. Now, this is kind of the simplified version that I use with my journalism students. But of course, if in a linguistics context, we want to go into some more detail. We want to make for a finer distinction, because for reasons we discovered there were interesting patterns into whether what we call judgment and what we call appreciation were used. Now, by judgment, we use this. Now, these are terms. We've made these in the appraisal framework. I mean, it's Martin and White mainly where this was set out, but others have contributed to this, and it was developed over 15 years and is still being developed. We chose the term judgment. It's used in everyday language. We chose to give it a definition. You need to kind of come up with your own jargon, don't you, obviously? So it's clear what you're referring to. You don't have to keep defining it. So affect, we mean emotional responses. judgment, and our definition is this: assessments of people's behavior or character by reference to social norms. So it's, you know, it's about ethics, morality, what's socially acceptable, its potential to be seen a more positive or negative light. But the crucial thing is that judgments are confined to evaluations of people's behavior or their character. So there's always got to be a person who's having their behavior or character assessed, and it's by reference to social norms, typical ethics, but also, you know, what's seen as plaudable or laudable or illaudable. So it's impolite of you to be using your mobile phone. It's obviously a judgment. Impoliteness is a breach of social acceptability. So if the student-ridden people who use their phones in class are impolite, they would have been going to this level of judgment. And of course, judging someone, presenting an assessment that's about social acceptability can be quite challenging, isn't it? That can be confronting. People object to being negatively assessed by reference to judgment. So that's one of the subtypes of attitude. The other, so we've had affect, that's judgment, and now appreciation. Again, we've taken a term that's used in everyday language and we've sort of technicalized it. So this we use to refer to assessments of entities or artifacts or happenings or state of affairs by reference to systems of social valuation. So often they're aesthetic. So they can be about calling something beautiful or well-formed or ugly or striking or interesting. And often in sort of journalism or politics, about, you know, whether a situation or an entity is harmful or beneficial. So here, of course, mobile phones are harmful. So we've assessed the phones. So the crucial thing is that we're not assessing people here, not directly. Often, of course, indirectly we are. So if people are, the people who are in favor of mobile phones, indirectly, we're criticizing them, but we're not directly accusing them of being thoughtless or impolite for having their phones in class. We focus rather on the object and we attribute that quality to them. So 3 subsystems. So yes, thank you, Azmi. Yes, can different culture have different judgment? Absolutely. I mean, I guess the definition, it's an interesting point. We've made this, we believe in our analysis of English, the sorts of English texts that we looked at, this came out of work on journalism. So it was very much, you know, directed at kind of journalism, and politics is all about, you know, correct, incorrect behavior. But also then it was developed for, you know, reviewing of art, you know, that's more the appreciation side, arts, entertainment. And for us, it seemed that it was an important distinction. We thought it was rhetorically significant in terms of kind of putting what it puts at risk. If I describe somebody who uses the mobile phone as thoughtless, it's more confrontational than me saying, well, mobile phones are harmful for concentration. I guess the point what we would see as judgment puts more at stake interpersonally. But I guess, yes, it's open to question. I guess this is, it's very much an English orientation, English culture, Western orientation. I guess some people have questioned whether, you know, the distinction between judgment and appreciation necessarily holds in other cultures, whether, and that would be a subject for further study. It's certainly not something that we would assume outright. We then have further subcategories within judgment appreciation, and I think that would be even more arguable whether those distinctions, more finer grained distinctions, hold across all cultures. Yeah, I mean, what we've put up is some suggestions, and it's up to people working in other cultures and other languages to decide, is it a fit or not? Is it, We certainly don't want to impose that Western English language-based perspective on other languages and other cultures. Yeah, thanks for that question. Very, very good question. Yeah, so there's just given you a taste of the attitude system. Now, just in terms of attitude, a crucial point is that, so how do we, what is the language resources by which positive and negative assessments can be realized, can be conveyed? Now, if I say the Secret Service agent, you know, somebody who works for the security, you know, somebody who protects the president, the Secret Service agent. This is from an actual text. This is actually a former president, President Reagan, was actually wounded and shot by an assailant, and this really did happen. His security detail stood in the way of the bullet and saved the president. The Secret Service agent took a bullet. Took a bullet means jumped in the way of the gunman and stopped the bullet striking the president. The Secret Service agent took a bullet for the president. Now, is that positive or negative of the Secret Service agent? What do people think? You probably say positive. And why? Why positive? Can you unpack that a bit? What are the cultural, see, when we're dealing with, it's a judgment, isn't it? We're judging the Secret Service positively judged, correct, laudable behavior, because of course cultural conventions. But of course, this is and that's because we assume that's the context. But of course, because there's no, we don't say the Secret Service courageously or selflessly took a bullet. We haven't expressed the judgment assessment explicitly, but we could hear how brave the Secret Service agent was. He took a bullet for the president. But of course, another thing is possible. The Secret Service agent took a bullet for the president. What an idiot. Who would be so stupid as to risk their life for a politician? I'm not sure if that's a view shared of politician in your countries, but it certainly is one shared in.
Yes, off the radar, please.
Now, my point here is that yes, because this is implicit, what we call invoked. Yes, we'll typically interpret it in a way, but until we inscribe an assessment, it's open to interpretation. So that's the contrast between implicit and explicit. And this is one of the most intriguing parts of an analysis of attitude, is unpacking the implicit assessment. So here's another case from American politics. George W. Bush delivered his inaugural speeches, going back many years now, before Obama. As George W. Bush delivered his inaugural speech as the United States president, who collected 537,000 fewer votes than his opponent. Now, if most people who believe in democracy would say, well, that's wrong. He's not the legitimate president. This is actually true. But of course, because of the weird American system, you can become elected without winning a majority of votes. So this potentially invokes or implies a negative view of the President Bush's election, but it's, you could argue, just the facts. It's a purely factual statement. It's factually true, but it implies, and it depends, of course, on the reader interpreting it, the reader having an understanding of what democracy is or what they expect of a democracy, and regarding that as wrong. So, yes, somebody, a comment? How do we deal with that in quality? Well, the point is, I get what we do is if we're going to, when we're doing a qualitative, well, either quantitative or qualitative, we would have to record this as an instance of implied attitude. We have to recognize the possibility. And if we're doing a quantitative analysis, we want to say, well, how many times was George Bush negatively evaluated in that text, you know, we would record how many times it was explicitly and how many times it was implicit. And we'd look, and there are further things to be looking at. So in both cases, but of course, I guess if often you will end up, if you think that it relies on cultural values or, you know, background knowledge that another reader might not have, and what you'll end up doing is like supplying a footnote to explain what would be the assumptions or the moral system which this relies on if it's going to be positive or negative. So now this is of course why inter-rater reliability can be an issue, because somebody who was a supporter of George Bush would say, yeah, well, so what? This is not a negative. This is the nature of the American system. Other presidents have been elected with fewer votes. I don't see this as putting him in a negative light. So would depend on reading position. So, but of course, the interesting thing is if you did find two readers taking different views of what was being conveyed, then there's an interesting point for discussion, because then you unpack the underlying assumptions or the reading position or the value system that is which is at work. But of course, we typically don't get an expression like this in isolation. There will be other pointers in the text as to whether the writer is positioning the reader to regard the election of George Bush as illegitimate. But still, sometimes it will be ambiguous. Maybe a text may choose to be ambiguous and leave it up to the, you know, and make it possible for one reader to regard it as positive and as negative. So that's one of the reasons for the challenge of this kind of analysis. I mean, some people might say, well, oh, it's too difficult.
Wow.
I can't get simple numbers. I can't say, oh, well, there were, you know, 35 negative evaluations of George Bush in this. But of course, if you want to get at how people are positioned, how these can be persuasive, then you need to be able to deal with both the implied and the explicit. Sometimes the text will give us some pointers. So for example, consider this one. The National Telephone Company, this is again, really happened in Australia. The National Telephone Company has withdrawn sponsorship of a suicide prevention phone service just days after announcing a 2.34 billion half-yearly offers. Now, most people would think, well, that's wrong. That's immoral. They would negatively judge the company for, you know, they've made a lot of money, but of course, relying on a particular value position, which believes that, you know, suicide preventions are important services. It's the moral thing to do. And if you're making so much profit, you shouldn't be doing that. But that's an interpretation. But notice here, we've got just days after, which implies that it's sooner than anyone would have expected. So we can add a little bit of a pointer to guide the reader. This is not simply just days after, is not just purely the facts. We've evaluated the time frame as being counter-expected, and counter-expectation typically points us in the direction of a negative or a positive. You know, we can say, well, he came top of his class and he only studied for one day, you know, only studied less than you would expect, and indicating that there's a value there. Here's another case in point. He only visits his mother once a year, even though she is more than 90 years old. Now, we haven't explicitly said he's a ungrateful son, or he's a poor son, he's unfilial. We haven't explicitly conveyed a negative assessment, but by saying only visits, less than we would expect, and even though, you know, so stressing that, emphasizing her age. If we just said he visits his 90-year-old mother once a year, of course, in context, we might think, well, that's mean of him. He's not being a dutiful son. But there wouldn't be the same suggestions of an assessment. So, as you can see, this implicit attitude can be sometimes what you might say as essentially a factual assertion, or we can have these little pointers, these indications of counter expectation or emphasis, even though, so stressing her age. Okay, so that gives you a broad, very quick account of the attitude system. Now we may run out of time, and you know, if there's enough interest, I'm certainly a later time. I'm happy to come back and
No, we do have time. You can explain more. Everybody's like
All
still
right,
interested.
Okay, we'll keep going if we've still got people who haven't rushed off. Yeah, okay. All right, so I realize I'm packing in a lot, but it was just to try and give people some sort of
that's a question, Peter. How do we know if it's intentional or not? I mean, like ambiguity.
Well, I guess we can speculate on whether it's intentional or not. But at the end of the day, as analysts, we can't get into the minds of the author. We don't, I mean, we can, how do we know? We can't offer conclusions as to the intentionality. All we can talk about is the potential effect. Whether, so for here we can say of this, well, we can argue, well, the National Telephone has withdrawn a response to suicide just days after announcing it turned 34. We can systematically say, well, this has the potential to position the reader to take a negative view of the telephone company, and we can explain that in terms of the notion that, you know, that it's the right thing to help people who might be thinking of suicide. Especially when people are, you know, there's cultural values that are being brought to bear here. And we can also point to the fact that just days after, so a lot shorter time than you would expect, you know, and so we can talk about the potential for it to position for the text, whether the author intended that or not is not really something we can reliably comment on. I know people love to kind of get into describing the intentions of the author. So yes, ideological square. Do you want to just speak to that a little bit? That was Jezer. Do you want to just put on your microphone and expand on that?
Yes, Jose, do you have any, do you want to talk a little bit?
Me?
Yes, talk about the ideological square model.
Okay, I asked this question because I had a question when I tried to do research about translation, because I see that in China, when people translate like news or something from English to Chinese, they will sometimes modify the language. They will manipulate the language. For example, several weeks ago, I saw that Mohd, when he came back to China, and he made a speech, and in that speech, he thanked the Canadian government, he thanked the judges, he thanked many different people. But when Chinese translators did the translation, they will delete the part. They will just simply skip that part, and they only talked about she thanked the Chinese government. Then obviously maybe they did it intentionally, but how do you know? You can't.
No, I mean you can't. You can speculate on that, can't you? I mean, you could make a case that plausibly, you know, and you could say an argument, you know, that it was plausible they intentionally did, would be to say, well, what would be the consequences in terms of how people are positioned to view, how the listener or the reader of that translation or that interpreting, how it positions them to view the people being referenced. And you could argue that might be, and that potential effect, you know, of only the Chinese side getting a positive, you know, perspective, being put in a positive light, that you could argue that lines up with a particular political agenda. And so you could argue plausibly that, yes, that it could have been intentional. But I guess we can never, you know, personally as linguists, I don't think I'd want to be definitive and say that they definitely was their intention. But we can certainly speculate. I mean, there's speculation that's just pure guesswork, and then there's sort of speculation that is based on some sort of a well-formulated argument. So yeah, that would be plausible, but the way to argue it is to talk about the potential consequences of that. Yes, I mean, like the note there about the ideological square, absolutely. I mean, appraisal is if you're observing, I mean, if you want to, in a systematic way, if they're in the chat, you know, you could actually track how, you know, who's getting positively assessed. So are we, how are we being positively assessed, and how, and to what extent is that emphasized, and how much is, and what about the us and them? So it's absolutely a tool if you wanted to track those sorts of emphasizing and de-emphasizing. If we go back to the second fight story, we already saw that, didn't we? We saw the young 9-year-old narrator emphasizing his positivity. He was restrained. He didn't give in, you know, he didn't immediately fight back. And he'd already emphasized the negative aspects of opponents. And so we see that at work. So absolutely, appraisal analysis will serve that kind of those sorts of observations if we see that going on in a text. If we've got an us and them, you know, the classic sort of CDA focus on the us and them, the othering, it's a very useful tool for tracking that kind of those emphasizing or de-emphasizing in a systematic way. Yeah, a good question. Yeah, does that
yes.
Is that yes? Yeah, a question, another one. How I've been translated, I feel happy is a relational process and a sentiment process, but I can say I feel happy is under the emotion. Right. So I guess the point to be made here is that when we, in attitude and the appraisal system generally, we are operating at the semantic level rather than the lexico-grammatical level. So even though I feel happy or I am happy is a relational process, the lexicogrammar, when we consider reporting emotions, there are a range of different lexicogrammatical realizations of emotion, and they include relational processes, obviously. So at the lexicogrammatical, and that's why we've proposed attitude as a semantics rather than a lexicogrammar, because there are all manner of different lexicogrammatical choices which can realize it. I mean, in terms of judgment or appreciation, we can do it through verbs. He betrayed his country. We can do it through relational processes. He's a traitor. We can do it through the adverbials. He treacherously, you know, spied on his nation. So we can't link judgment to any particular lexicogrammatical option. It's actually attributes, verbs, nouns. He's a traitor. The traitor, you know. So that's I guess an important thing to realize is that it's at a higher level semantically than the lexico. So those meanings, the wordings in which we divide up the different forms of process, we need to get a more abstract view of that from the meaning rather than the wording. Does that I'm not sure who that question came from. I couldn't see in the chat, but does that clarify the point about? Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. If you did a transitivity analysis of the way that emotion or affect was realized, you could end up with even more subtle insights. Well, yes, I mean, the point is, we can't avoid this. I mean, the point is, it's going to be subjective. I mean, we've sort of, there's this ideology that we get into linguistics, and it comes out of the myth in the physical sciences that they are objective, the myth of objectivity. What we're doing is we are making overt and systematic our individual reading of the text. And so it's subjective, but it's explicitly subjective. So it behoves us, if it's going to be plausible and well-founded and valuable to other people, it's important that we can systematically account for our subjective interpretation. I mean, some things, some things are not going to be arguable. The inscriptions, what we call the explicit, he's a corrupt politician. If we classify that as negative judgment, propriety, morality, people aren't going to question that. Something like unabashed is potentially going to depend on the reading position. So as long as we are explicit about the position we're coming from, what are our values, that we have to reflect, don't we? For it to be valid and useful, we have to be reflective. We have to be conscious. We have to make explicit in our own minds what are the values that we are bringing to bear in when we decide that that's a positive or a negative. And of course, we've got to allow for the possibility that this is a potential reading. This is that you as the analyst read this as negative, but you have to allow for the possibility that another reader might not. And you can outline the terms on what would be their belief by which they wouldn't see that as negative. I mean, in the George Bush example, you could argue, well, George Bush delivered his inaugural speech for the United States, collected 537,000 votes. I regard that as implying a negative view of the George Bush's election, but I would then, I might, if it was an important point of the analysis, I would have a footnote and says this is based on my view that a democracy ought to depend on simply the votes. But I might acknowledge that someone who doesn't have that view and understands the American system, that they might regard this as perfectly natural and not a negative in terms of his election. It doesn't make his election illegitimate. So you could see there's the subjectivity, but you're acknowledging that and documenting the basis for the subjectivity. That was that Gigi? Yeah. So yes, I mean it's a different kind of analysis than if I know in many linguistics people like to have many, like we're dealing with parts of speech, arguably they can be objectively identified and counted, for example. But even parts of speech, of course, there can be points of argument. But it's not the sort of thing that you can have a simple account, although a lot of accounting will work, because many of the instances will not be so kind of contingent on the reading position, on the values that the analyst is bringing to the text. So all right, well, look, if we've got a little bit of time,
sorry, Prof, there is one more question.
Oh yes, go ahead. Yep. How can we integrate SFL into the teaching of writing? Yeah, okay, well, yes, there's a whole course to be had in that question. The point is, what we've found is if people are familiar with like the genre school that's associated with Professor Martin and other colleagues, like sometimes called the Sydney genre school. You may be familiar, it identifies different types of storytelling. It identifies different types of argument, different types of report based on their staging. But we've also found that also there are patterns in the use of evaluative meanings. So part of being able to tell a good story is being able to manage the you know, the evaluative resources. So, I mean, if we go back to, let me just go back to our story texts. Okay, now, are people familiar with the Sydney school system of genre, different story types or not? Any, where are people familiar with that or not? Perhaps not. Well, in the Sydney Genre School, we would say, and the Sydney Genre, well, we can certainly use, yes, many people have used appraisal to analyze literary texts because, you know, absolutely, say you're interested in novels. How are we positioned to view the different characters in a novel? You know, that's all many novels about, regarding someone as morally sound and someone as suspect, or someone as conflicted, someone as, you know, inconsistent. So if we wanted to say characterization in novels, we would apply like we look at how we're positioned and to regard this person as entirely positive or partially, you know, as a character who's somewhat compromised or mixed morally. And we would look for both inscribed, explicit, and both implicit. So absolutely people have used it to look at literature, certainly in sort of novels, short stories, but poetry. A friend, a colleague of mine, has used it to look at, you know, like poetry. We have a sort of a poem that's become sort of iconic in Australia. Probably other you people have perhaps similar poems which have almost become to represent, you know, the national spirit. And our poem, which is known by all, it's taught to all school children. I love a sunburnt country, a land of sweeping plains, and it goes on like that. It's a poem about Australia that supposedly gives the essence of the Australian, and that can be analysed in terms of how attitude is used to represent the country. You know, I love a sunburnt country. Like, who would? I mean, like, sunburnt, is that a good thing to have a country? Well, Australia is very hot and dry, and
No.
so it's sort of, so you can see how attitude is being used there to position us to love what might be seen as a negative. So that's a famous poem. So another application to a literary text. Yeah, I mean, I won't dwell on it, but if we look at Fight Story 1, it's what we would call in the analysis, it's called a recount. It's just simply a sequence of events, no attitude, no evaluation. It's all just categorically asserted. The Fight Story 2 is what we would call, it's a narrative with it's a much more sophisticated narrative because it has an introduction, an orientation. I was walking on the home to school. Then it has a complication which is a problem, a challenge, a threat. Whereas the fact in text 1, the fact that somebody came up to me and threatened him was a fight is not presented as a problem. So it's got a complication. It then has this evaluative element, the attitudinal element about how he was concerned. He lost his temper, and then it's got a resolution. He wins the battle, and then it has what we call a coda, which sort of wraps up the story. And I think I was a victor, so it sort of casts their eye back. This is a genre analysis of this as being a narrative. And if we look, the actual attitudinal elements of this are a crucial part of it. So in terms of teaching genre, we would be focusing both on the staging, but also on the attitudinal work that's going on there. So absolutely, it combines very well. If any of you are using, you know, the genre kind of models and looking at different stagings of text, then you would find that there's a lot that you can do with that. Okay, so perhaps we could easily go on all night, but let me just give you a quick taste of engagement, and let me just give you a sense, just a taste. and we can then wrap it up here. And again, as I said, often our methodology is to consider alternatives and ask ourselves, okay, what's the difference in terms of the potential impact on the listener or the reader? So here, say we go back to the little text about Trump and his rhetoric. There is a direct link between Trump's rhetoric and the white nationalism which led to this shooting. Now, this is a categorical assertion. It presents this as unproblematic. It almost doesn't. It assumes that the reader is not going to find this problematic, that the writer, the speaker can just declare this, what of course, for some would be very controversial. A supporter of Trump would challenge this, would feel affronted, confronted by the directness of it, the fact that it was categorically asserted. So when somebody asserts in such a bare way a proposition that's likely to be contested, that's likely going to alienate people, lead to an argument, this is to be noted. This is an important choice they make, because of course, let's look at the alternatives. Of course, there is a direct link between Trump's rhetoric and the white nationalism which led to this shooting. Sorry, I think I've got a spelling error there. I always do that. Led. Okay. So here, of course, what's the difference between the first one? There is a direct link, and of course there is a direct link. Well, we discussed, of course. Of course is a curious term, isn't it? It implies that you know this already. The reader knows this. They agree with me. So if they agree with me, why do I bother saying it? Why bother to? But what is important, because it's constructing an alliance, an alignment between the reader. The writer here is projecting onto the reader a viewpoint, is projecting onto them a negative view of Trump, and that there is this link with what he has to say and white nationalism. So this is a dialogistic positioning. What if it was admittedly there is a direct link between Trump's rhetoric and the white nationalism? This is another choice. There, of course, what it's implying is that the reader isn't the writer here, the speaker is sort of reluctantly agreeing, but also presenting this is a view that other people would have. They're sort of acknowledging someone else's view and reluctantly agreeing with them. So this is an important alternative. What if it was there is a direct link between Trump's rhetoric and the white nationalism which led this shooting, because Trump has previously endorsed violent protests by white supremacists. Sorry, again, my spelling has failed me today. Supremacist groups. Now, so here the writer has felt the need, has anticipated that the reader may not accept this, that they can't just assert it. They've got to offer some support. What's their basis for this claim that there's a direct link between his rhetoric and this very negative white nationalism? So they've felt the need to bolster, they felt the need to justify, and in so doing, they've presented this proposition that Trump has a link with white nationalism that leads to murder. There's a need to bolster it, to argue for the case. So an important dialogistic, presenting the reader as possibly not accepting this, but stressing the proposition. Or what about, in my view, there is a direct link between Trump's rhetoric and the white nationalism that led to this shooting. What do we do when we say in my view or arguably? We are presenting this explicitly as my opinion, and hence just my opinion. Other people may disagree with me. It's allowing for the possibility that others hold an alternative view. So again, an important choice in terms of how we're engaging with, and this anticipates in a way, doesn't it, that the reader may not have this view. Certainly it's not something that can be presented categorically. Or we can bring in a source. Democratic candidate Europe has declared there is a direct link between Trump. So this is just one person's view. It's not the author's view. It's another. So it's just one person's view, and it depends on the reader's view of the source, the Democratic candidate, whether they will regard this as compelling or not. Or Democratic candidate Peter O'Rourke claims there is a direct link between Trump's rhetoric and white nationalism. What's the effect of you choosing claims here? What are we anticipating with respect to the reader, or how are we positioning ourselves with respect to this prior speaker? How do you interpret claim? Anyone like to?
It's like kind of distancing himself from.
Yeah, exactly. It's the writer is sort of stepping right back, aren't they? They're really stressing this is this person's view and not my view. You know, don't mistake that I'm. So they're really opening up the space, aren't they, for the person addressed to hold a different view. Yeah. So we call that, in the system of engagement, we call that distancing. Now, this is not the complete. If you look in the appraisal literature, you'll see we have a whole system of these choices. And as you can see, they're quite crucial, aren't they, in the way that what we anticipate of the reader. Do we assume that the reader is broadly an agreement, or likely to find this unproblematic, or may well disagree with us, or may completely disagree with us? So it's about anticipating how the reader is going to respond, and anticipating reader responses is a crucial part of effective writing in many forms, but particularly of persuasive writing. So you can see just in a little illustration of the system we have for tracking what propositions are presented as unproblematic, as generally agreed on, what are presented as problematic, as controversial, what propositions are presented as likely to be a point of disagreement between the writer, the speaker, and the addressee. So that's probably enough for this evening. I hope that's given people a sense, just a quick sense of the kind of range of what the appraisal framework offers.
Yes, definitely, Prof. Because when for everyone's information, there is a book which is called Language of Evaluation, written by Dr. Martin and White, 2005. It had became like Bible to us. So I really appreciate for you being here, especially on the engagement just now. I always got confused with that. And can we open the camera for everyone so that I can do a print screen and take photo and probably send to you later?
Yes, that would be good.
Yes. Thank you very much. I can see Phoebe, Siswanto. That's Prof. Sabrina. Gigi, I would like to see you. I mean, somebody said that you might look like Gigi Hadid. Thank you so much, everyone.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes,
Certainly.
please do.
It's about, because in Appraisal Theory we have 3 systems, then after each, below each system there's many subdivisions. Do you have like a special designation for each category? Types, sub-values, or values?
We certainly, I mean, yes, I guess we within attitude, you know, we have, as you saw, judgment, we have an appreciation and affect, and we have definitions for, of course, when you're doing analysis, you have to you need recognition criteria, you know, so which means like, so if I'm going to claim this is on what basis I'm going to claim this is judgment, so yes, we would have that. We would hopefully the definitions we have. So, I mean, the book, it's Martin and White 2005, where these are set out. But of course, then we have subsystems. So within judgment, there are 5 subtypes. And again, we have, there are 5 subtypes. So
you use the word subtypes. Is that what we use in?
We would say subtypes. So there are 5 subtypes of judgment.
Okay.
there are, and they could have, even if you wanted, you could go into more delicacy, more detail. You could have subtypes of subtypes, but the current system, as in the Martin and White 2005, the language of evaluation, we have 5 subtypes. Well, there are 2 broad subtypes of judgment. There's what we call social sanction, and those are values which are like, typically, if it's a negative, you're in breach of some law or some religious, it's immoral. It's like being cruel or dishonest or treacherous. These are all at the level of either kind of civil laws or religious laws. They're the sort of thing where these are very serious. If you're a liar, you're dishonest, you're a traitor. But then we have what we call social esteem. Now, these are not in breach of a law, but like if you're clumsy, it's not morally wrong to be clumsy, but it's like incapacity. If you're skillful, you're not morally, you don't say, oh, he's a good person, he's skillful, but you would say, oh, he's a good person, he's honest. So we have those 2 broad categories, and so the social esteem are things like capacity or the normality. He's eccentric. Now that's an interesting one. Eccentric can be good or bad. Eccentric mean not doesn't behave in a normal way, or what we call tenacity. That's being if you're determined, or that's being tenacious in a good way, determined, or being tenacious in a bad way is to be obstinate. It's a negative to be obstinate, to resist, to go your own way regardless. So, but it's not morally wrong to be obstinate, whereas it is morally wrong to be a liar, to be a cheat, to be cruel, and that distinction is, I think, is an interesting one. That certainly came out of English journalism and politics, that distinction. Now, it might be other cultures don't recognize, a difference between the moral order and just what is going to see you applauded, in your society. And within those, so within what we call social esteem, we have what we call tenacity, which is having the right mental disposition or the wrong mental disposition, being obstinate, being lazy, being tenacious, being brave. An interesting one culturally is it morally right to be brave, or is it just applaudable being brave? Whereas being in certainly in my culture, being kind or unkind, that's a question of moral standing. Being skillful or unskillful, being strong, being weak, that's positive or negative, but it's not a moral issue. I wouldn't say he's a bad person, he's weak, but I would say he's a bad person, he's a liar, or he tells lies. So would you say he or she's a bad person, or he or she's a good person? That tells us we're in that order of what we call social sanction. Sanction meaning subject to either religious or kind of state laws. So there's a subdivision. So some analyses you wouldn't bother to go beyond. I mean, some analysis you don't bother to. It depends on your question. You might just be interested in whether an attitude is judgment, appreciation, or affect. That might be enough, and that might tell you all you need to know, all you've got time to work on. But then you might say, oh, well, actually, there's a lot of judgment, so that's important. So I will just look to whether it's what we said, that social sanction or social esteem. Or you might say, no, I want to go deeper. I mean, one of my PhD students who's just finished, she did very well she's a Chinese student. She did an analysis of there's a Chinese reality TV program in mainland China where couples who are, thinking of getting a divorce, there's been a family breakup, and they go on TV and kind of argue between themselves in front of sort of counselors and, kind of blame each other for a marriage breaking down. Now, she's analyzed their interactions, how they position the audience to take, they're trying to present themselves positively. It's, I was always the person, I was, it's he or she's the bad person. And she only analyzed it in terms of, she didn't go beyond seeing whether it was appreciation, judgment, or affect, because she didn't need to go into any more detail. She was also a little bit reluctant about dealing with the subtypes of judgment because, well, it was Chinese, and there's not been as much work on Chinese, but a very effective analysis, just considering, because what she did is then track not just whether it was judgment, affect, or appreciation, but who was the target. So, and of course, what was interesting is that she found that the different partners, the spouses, they differed into how often they paused. They're obviously often negative about their partner because they were in a marriage breakdown situation. But how often some were never positive ever in the whole half hour about their partner, but some were positive. They did say, he could be kind, or in the past he was kind, or they could be, in some cases, they admitted fault on their own. They were negative about their own behavior. So you could get different identities according to how often they were prepared to be at least occasionally positive judgment about their partner. So all she needed to do for a very effective analysis was track judgment, appreciation, or affect, and who was the target of the assessment, who was being evaluated. She didn't need to go into the subtypes. But in another analysis, when we wanted to look at, this came out originally, I was interested in the different types of journalism, news reporting versus commentary or editorials. And there was a type of journalism, because I used to be a journalist and I was very aware of this, what was called sort of analysis. You might even see it if you read, English newspaper, English language, you see the label news, because an article will be labeled analysis, and another one will be opinion or commentary. And what we found was the distinction between social sanction. The commentator they freely inscribed all types of judgment. They were free to judge persons' moral behavior, to call them, to label them a bad person. Whereas the analyst didn't, they might judge a politician for their skill or their resolve, but not for their morality. So it was we actually found that it was by looking at the difference, so having that distinction between the social sanction, the more highly charged, more at stake, and the social esteem, just whether you're going to be praised or criticized, was an important distinction for analyzing. Now that's an interesting question, isn't it? Is that just a feature of certain types of English language journalism that we have that division? It may well be in other cultures. You don't have, that kind of patterning in terms of use of subtypes of judgment. So yeah, appreciation. There are subtypes of appreciation. It depends on your research question whether you need to delve into the subtypes and look for patterns in terms of the frequency of the different subtypes. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Prof. White. And together with us, we have the Dean for Center for Language Studies at UTHM, Associate Professor Dr. Zailin Shah. Dr. Zailin, could you say a few words to Prof. White? Thank you. Is Dr. Zailin around? Yes.
You've put me on the spot here. Thank you very much, Prof. White, for an enlightening talk today. I'm not able to switch on my camera, so I hope the audience can like learn a lot from you. I think I this is not my area, but I learned a lot. The last time I did something like this was, I think, when I did my courses during the PhD. So
Yes.
thank you very much. Thank you very much. I was trying to follow everything. Not sure if I can actually apply it yet. Maybe need more sessions with you in order to actually apply it. So thank you very much for giving us new knowledge today.
Well, thank you. That it was a pleasure. It's always a pleasure to talk with people interested in this area, and certainly, you know, now with these days, now we have Zoom or whatever, or you know, I'm certainly happy to come back if people wanted to have other sessions. Absolutely, no problem at all. We can do that very easily. And so just, you know, just reach out again if you'd like some follow-up sessions. And for everyone here, of course, there's all those links there on the web page. There's sort of introductory materials, which are sort of a way of leading you into the Martin and White 2005, which I guess is the reference. I'm working on a follow-up book to that at the moment, which I hope will be out next year. Sort of more of a manual how to apply it. So look out for that. But yeah, and certainly if you have questions, don't hesitate to get in touch. So hope to speak with you, more of you, or again, you know, it's soon.
Yes. Ila is here, so she will always keep us in touch with one another.
Excellent.
Thank you so much. Yeah, Dr. Zaini.
Yes, so yes. All right. I had an email. Yes, I'll give you my email. I had a query. So it is my UNS. I'll just send that through. It's actually on the PowerPoint if you lose this, but that's my email address. So if you have questions, I mean, the thing with appraisal, as you perhaps got a sense of today, it's difficult to just learn from reading the book.
Yes.
It really we find that it's a question of being able to talk and discuss issues, and you know, sometimes we sit and have a half an hour discussion of a single sentence. It can be that complicated. So by all means, you know, it certainly would be, I'd be happy to do some sessions where we actually look at in more detail at some texts and work through the analyses. Yeah.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank to everyone for being here this evening. We're supposed to have like 1 hour, but since Prof. White has so many things to tell us. Oh yes, we have Associate Professor Dr. Haslina Harun. Yes. Would you like to say something?
Oh no, I was just putting the good sign, saying that everything's all right. Great. Thank you very much, Professor White.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think that's the end of the discussion. It is more of the discussion. Prof. White highlighted whatever that we have doubt, especially the engagement part. And I was doing on attitude, and some of my students are doing attitude too.
Yeah.
And once again, thank you very much to everyone. Don't forget to fill in the attendance form and the evaluation form. And I can see Associate Professor Dr. Hanita Hassan from UTM, and then Dr. Ang Peisu from UM, and Dr. Haslina Harun from USM. So hopefully, whatever that we have gathered here, we're going to have like another systemic functional linguistic appraisal analysis group in Malaysia. That would be good.
Yes, well, certainly that would be great. So you know, by all means, if anything I can do to assist, just reach out. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you, everyone.
Stay safe.
Nice to meet with you. Thank you. It was some very interesting points and some very insightful observations and questions. Yes, so thank you for that. Yeah, it's very stimulating. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye then. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye, everyone. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here.
Congrats, Kak Ila, for the program.
Thank you. We're going to have like more of this. Thank you.
Ila, you put me in a spot there. Tak apalah. Anyway, congrats.
Thank you, Kak Lin. Yeah, you are the spotlight. You're the highlight.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Bye semua. Bye. Bye everyone.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone. Stop.
Hello and salam, and many thanks for all of you. And I'm so honored that I got this opportunity to be here with you.
Thank you.
I got a lot, actually, especially that I have 2 chapters related to appraisal language or evaluative language related to attitudes, and the negotiable language, and also the 2 approaches that I adopted in my study, the conceptualized approaches of White and Martin. So, and also I'd like to seize the chance to thank my supervisor, Dr. Ang Biso, for her care, kindness, generosity, and also inviting me and informing me to attend this interesting and nice lecture, and to be among those distinguished, privileged colleagues and doctors, professors, and other members. So thank you. Many thanks for you.
Welcome,
and all the best.
Thank you for being here.
And may God be pleased with you. Thank you.
Welcome. All right. So we have put the live session on CLS webpage on Facebook. So if you like to know more, or you would like to return to the notes, please feel free to go there. And perhaps I will also put on YouTube TV, UTHM YouTube TV. All right, everyone, thank you so much for being here. And I can see Dr. Hafuz. Thank you for being here. All right, well, bye everyone. I need to leave. Thank you so much. Don't forget to fill in the attendance form, and also the another one, which is the survey. All right, thank you.